are watching the multi-awarded Radio Bandido TV on channel 224 Sky Cable and TV Plus boxes. Simulcast on DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Informing, advising, and entertaining the Filipinos and OFWs around the world. Streaming live on www.facebook.com/DZRJ 8:10 a.m. or on YouTube, channel DZRJ 8:10 a.m. Radio Bandido.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.
Hello, Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam right here on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. My name is Lecain. We bring you the most interesting news stories from around the world each week, live right here in the beautiful Makati. Now, this week we're going to take a look at the escalating problems going on in the Middle East. And is it an all-out war coming soon between Israel and Iran? Also, the doomed Air India flight that crashed this week, killing everyone on board but one. We'll look at the Harvey Weinstein court decision, which keeps changing, and the Sean Puffy Diddy Combs trial, which makes us all go, OMG, who are these people? And finally, the U.S. The military going to Los Angeles to do what? And the massive protests across the entire U.S. as Trump celebrates his birthday with a military parade. So let's get to it. If you thought that maybe in the Middle East things were going to come to a close soon, maybe because, people are dying, entire societies are disappearing, and things need to de-escalate, well, you would be wrong. This past Friday morning, Israel took its war to another level. Before, it was fighting against Hamas, a military enemy with limited firepower and in its own country. But now, Israel has upped the stakes. It's gone up against someone much, much more powerful, Iran. Israel sent 200 fighter jets in the early morning hours into Iran with a mission to cripple Iran's nuclear programs. Operation Rising Lion was aimed at taking out the Iranian military leadership and destroying Iran's nuclear facilities, which Israel believes will one day destroy them. Now, Iran has claimed that its nuclear program is for civilian purposes only, to simply provide power to homes in the country, and that it has complied with the international rules in its research of nuclear power. However, many out in the world do not believe this. Of course, Israel being one of those. The big issue is how much enriched weapons-grade uranium that Iran actually has. The International Atomic Energy Agency is saying that Iran may have enough material to make around 9 nuclear bombs. Now, this is not entirely proven. However, Israel doesn't really need all that much proof. Just a possibility is enough for them. Now, both Iran and Israel have completely closed their airspace from commercial airplanes and have pointed their weapons right at each other. In other words, this is vastly moving to the level of an all-out war. Once the attack from Israel happened, Iran immediately retaliated by sending around 100 drones into the heart of Israel. Now, the Iron Dome defensive system and the U.S. military have thwarted most of those drones, but some have managed to get through, causing multiple injuries and 2 deaths. But remember, this is from just Friday. Back in Iran, Israel also ran several covert missions at the same time on the ground, setting off explosives aimed at damaging Iran's strategic missile sites and defense capabilities. We know this because Israel shot videos of it and posted it. Israel targeted specific people. You can see several buildings with specific apartments being destroyed. They specifically went after certain apartments. Of course, the best way to slow the building of nuclear weapons is to kill the people building them. So they targeted nuclear scientists in the country. Supposedly 6 of them have been killed already. Also the chief of staff of the Iranian Armed Forces, the commander of the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the commander of the Iran's Emergency Command were all killed on Friday's strike. They had particular people that they were targeting to kill. Since this all happened in the middle of the night, most of them were just home sleeping. Also, the senior advisor to the Iranian supreme leader, the Ayatollah, he was seriously injured. This is reminiscent of the attacks on Hamas, where they went after all the leaders first. Now, from what we know, 200 Israeli fighter jets were sent in, hitting 100 separate targets. And, like I said, Iran on Friday vowed a major retaliation to this attack. Iran's foreign ministry said its armed forces would not hesitate to defend Iran's sovereignty with full strength and the manner they deem appropriate. But there was also more to this statement. They also said the U.S. government bears some responsibility for this attack, mostly because it is the U.S. that has provided the weapons that Israel has used for the cause that made so much destruction. In the past year, the U.S. has come under much criticism for providing weapons to the Israeli military to kill civilians in Gaza, most of those women and children. This pushed the then President Biden to suggest to Israel to stop killing civilians, or that they would cut off their supply of weapons. Although since Trump has become president, they have not been quite as hard on Israel, but the Trump administration did ask Israel not to fire on Iran. We talked about this on the show several months ago when Israel said that eventually it was going to go after Iran's nuclear program. Trump specifically asked them not to attack Iran because this would start an all-out conflict and could cause many problems to the ongoing nuclear arms deals that they're trying to make with Iran. The interesting thing is that even though Trump asked them not to do this, they did it anyway. Trump came into the presidency being a great ally and friend to Netanyahu. However, recently, that relationship has kind of soured a bit. Remember, Netanyahu was completely omitted from Trump's recent trip to the Middle East. And when Netanyahu asked to be given a little slack from the massive Trump tariffs, well, he was all but ignored. But now Trump has a question to answer. If Iran does an all-out assault on Israel, does Trump involve the U.S. military to help protect it? Anyway, the first thing the U.S. Secretary of State did was try to distance itself from the attack, saying that they had no involvement in the attack nor in the planning of it, and that no matter what Israel does, the U.S. would protect its troops that are currently in the area. The Secretary made the announcement that Iran should not target the U.S. and its interest or personnel. In other words, we didn't do this, so please leave the U.S. out of it. Which also puts Netanyahu in an interesting situation. As I have said on the show before, that many believe that Netanyahu wants to continue with conflicts because it's what keeps him in power. He said, if not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time, could be a year, could be within a few months, less than a year. This is a clear and present danger to Israel's very survival. And well, this very well may be true. I mean, right now, I don't think Iran would resort to using a nuclear weapon on Israel. However, who knows who the next leader of Iran might be? Maybe someone who would think, we have this power, why not use it? And many tend to believe that Iran currently has or could easily get the power to send a weapon of mass destruction to Israel. As of right now, Iran is saying that 78 people have been killed and 320 people injured as Israel has attacked again. But also, Iran has attacked Israel again, much harder. In the 3 days since this whole thing's been going on, each keeps throwing what it has at the other. At this point, by my count, At least 10 people have been killed in Israel in the Sunday attacks to bring a total death in Israel to 13. 6 of those, including 2 children, died in a missile that broke through the defense and, slammed into an apartment building. 180 have been injured, and several are still missing under the rubble. Now, this is just Israel. Back over in Iran on Sunday, multiple explosions happened. The Israeli military went after a natural gas processing plant. So it seems Israel is now targeting Iran's oil and gas refinement plants. 78 people were killed, 320 wounded. After this, world's leaders issued an urgent message to both countries to stop this for a time until something can be worked out. But the Prime Minister of Israel said that Israel's strikes so far are nothing compared to what they will feel under the sway of our forces in the coming days. So after this all talks between the U.S. and Iran involving the Iran nuclear plan have all been called off. The negotiations, which seem to be giving Iran an off-ramp to its weapons program, is now stopped. This week was supposed to be the 6th round of discussions, but the top diplomat from Iran said that the nuclear talks were now unjustified after Israel's attacks, and he went on to say these attacks are a result of the support of the United States. This has provoked Trump to say that if we are attacked in any way, shape, or form by Iran, the full strength and might of the U.S. armed forces will come down on you at levels you have never seen before. However, we can easily get a deal done between Iran and Israel, and in this bloody conflict, Trump continues to say how easy it would be to make deals to stop all the wars around the world. However, he is quickly finding out that it's actually easier to start a war, but can be very hard to stop one. And this seems to be the beginning of an all-out war between Israel and Iran. A war seemingly easily started by Israel. Of course, Israel has a different point of view. Even though Iran has shown no intention of attacking Israel, Israel seemed to be pushing the idea that in order to preserve their safety, they needed to attack Iran. Kind of a preemptive strike to save their country. But as we know from past shows, Israel has wanted to do this kind of attack for quite some time. It seems the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023 gave them the catalyst they needed in order to continue to make such attacks, using the assumption that Iran and Hamas are somewhat intertwined, that by Hamas attacking them, it was also an attack by Iran. It's also the fact that Donald Trump was elected president, which gave Netanyahu the confidence to finally realize his goal of going after Iran. The issue now, we will have to wait and see how far Israel is willing to take this. And will the U.S. try and stop them or just let them completely destabilize the region? I mean, if you think this is going to just simply stay a battle between Israel and Iran, you most likely will be wrong. You know, Israel has been waiting for a reason to attack Iran, but the whole Middle East has been waiting for a reason to remove Israel from the earth. So let's see who removes who first. And this is the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio, talking about stories going on around the world. I am Eric Lecain. It was August 16th, 1987. Northwest Airlines just taken off from Detroit Airport around 8:45 in the evening. It was actually just on its way to Phoenix for a stop before heading to California. Everything had been fairly uneventful, nothing out of the ordinary. The plane took off, but its initial ascent, the wings began to roll from side to side. Then the left wing hit a light pole, which damaged the wing and caused the plane to hit several other light poles, and then the roof of a rental car company. The plane could not gain any more altitude, and it hit the ground and began sliding as it broke up into pieces and crashed into what looked like an overpass. 156 people died in that crash, including several people on the ground, all the flight crew, all the passengers on board the plane, everybody but one. One 4-year-old girl from Arizona was the sole survivor on that flight. Her parents, her 6-year-old brother, died in the flight. However, somehow she survived. Then, a Vietnam airline, Flight 815, back in 1997. It's on its final approach when something went horribly wrong. It crashed around 800 meters from the runway. Supposed to be at 14,000 feet, but for some reason, it was at 10,000 feet. The airport had a VOR, which is that device used for supporting the runway. However, it was stolen several months before, and the pilot needed to have visual contact with the runway lights, which had also been stolen, but supposedly had been replaced. As the pilot came in for landing, he kept saying he could not see the runway. He was told to, and was supposed to change runways, but for some reason stayed on the same runway. As the plane lowered, you could hear the co-pilot saying to the captain, "You need to abort the landing," but it was already too late. The plane hit some trees, went out of control, then it hit a house, and then it crashed. All the people on that plane were killed, all but one. A 14-year-old boy from Thailand broke both his legs, had injuries, but survived. 2 cows on the ground were decapitated. 65 people lost their lives from that crash. All but that one baby. This past week, an Indian Air Boeing 787 Dreamliner left the Indian airport heading for the UK. 242 people on board, including 169 Indian nationals, 53 British nationals, 7 Portuguese nationals, 1 Canadian. Once it took off from the strip, the pilot almost immediately said that there was a problem and called for a mayday. Then he said, "No thrust, losing power, unable to lift." Those were the last words he spoke. In the video, you see the plane flying into the horizon as it slowly dips down, and then a massive explosion. The plane hit a medical building head on. Flames and smoke plumed high in the air. 24 people in that medical building instantly were killed. All 242 people on the plane were killed, all but one. A 38-year-old British man suffered some impact injuries, but literally got up and walked off the plane. He said, "When I got up, there were bodies all around me. I was scared. I stood up and ran. There were pieces of the plane all around me. Someone grabbed hold of me, put me in an ambulance, and brought me to the hospital." A relative of the man said he had no idea how he survived. How did he get out of the plane? Experts have already come to say that in a crash like this, on a jet of this size, full of jet fuel in an uncontrolled crash landing, the chances of survival are near zero. There's just so many factors. The human body's just so fragile when falling from heights. Especially as the plane makes impact, the spine will break. There's sometimes massive chest impact injuries. And of course, the plane usually fills with smoke. So even if the person were to survive the initial impact, they would die from the intense smoke. The fact that this man walked out of the plane after this type of crash is nothing short of a miracle, according to experts. They still don't know exactly what happened in the 33 seconds of when the plane left the ground until it crashed into the medical center. Currently, investigators are looking into 3 possible causes of the crash: a problem with the engine thrusters, the device that pushes the plane forward, a problem with the flaps. That's the point where the plane goes upward from takeoff, and a possibility of maybe some type of terrorist issue. Could the plane have been tampered with before the flight? The question from the initial finding is, why was the landing gear open for so long after takeoff? The first of the black boxes was recovered from the roof of the medical building, and it's being looked at. Of course, the biggest question is, how did that one person survive? He was seated in 11A, the luckiest seat on the plane, and the plane broke in half, the back half exploding into a fireball, but then the front half crashed into the building. but then it left him in the back of the front half. So everyone in the front was killed of blunt trauma and smoke, but he was at the end of what is now the back of the plane. So he could just walk right out of the back. It was a 1 in a million. Most likely he won't know. Anyway, we won't know much about this crash for, I guess, 3-6 months. And the final report probably be out in a year. That's how long these things usually take. But they have already put together a team of investigators from the UK and India. And as we know from previous crashes, these kind of things, they take time. First, they need to study the wreckage, and then they need to move it to a large hangar, and then it starts the procedure of picking it apart piece by piece. Then the decision of whether the plane was bad, the maintenance people were bad, the pilot was bad, or something else. As of today, 270 bodies have been recovered. This includes the people on the ground. Officials are still trying to figure out how many of the people were actually killed on the ground. And they're trying to match the DNA samples they have to the bodies so they can begin to, try and figure out who's who. India's Prime Minister Modi spent around 20 minutes walking around the site, looking at the plane crash. He also visited the hospital to meet some of the people injured on the ground from the crash. This included the sole survivor of the plane. He said the entire nation is praying for their speedy recovery. It's interesting, though, how sometimes in these kinds of crashes, someone is spared. Not 2 people or 3 people, but just one. How a 14-month-old baby or a 4-year-old or a 38-year-old managed to survive. Sometimes it makes us think about our faith or whose hands it's really in. Maybe it's your time. And then by all odds and statistics, somehow, it's not. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ Radio and Radio Bandito TV. We're talking about interesting stories going on around the world. So Harvey Weinstein is in the news this week. Now, Harvey is a film producer. He made such films as Sex, Lies, and Videotape, The Crying Game, Pulp Fiction, Shakespeare in Love. I'm just naming the movies that I've seen. In any case, he made some great films and was very admired as a movie maker. There was just one problem. Harvey likes the ladies, especially the young women trying to make it in the movie business. So Harvey, who's not the most attractive man I've ever seen, would invite women to his room with the possibility of a starring role in one of his movies. However, when they got to his room, there would be a certain price that you had to pay in order to get into one of those movies. And it wasn't just good acting. Anyway, this was the kind of way things, how you could get a break into the business back then in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. The problem was, if you didn't have sex with Harvey when he wanted, he would threaten to have you blacklisted in every studio in Hollywood. Women at the time were pretty scared to come forward about the sexual abuse, but later in the 2000s, women got a bit more bolder. As of now, 80 women have made allegations of sexual misconduct or rape by Weinstein. Basically, Weinstein became the catalyst for the Me Too movement, the social media campaign against powerful men in the world who have abused women. Okay, so in 2018, Weinstein was charged with rape in the city of New York, and 2 years later, he was found guilty in 2 of the 5 felonies. He got 23 years in prison for that. He was then found guilty in Los Angeles of 3 of 7 counts he was facing there. He was sentenced to 16 years for that. Now, Harvey's been appealing his sentence in New York, and in 2024, an appeals court overturned the verdict. The reason was that the court allowed evidence of other abuse that happened before the actual abuse he was being charged with. Questions were being asked if Harvey had testified already. This was a real blow to the women accusing Weinstein. The judge that oversaw the case was crazy mad. He said the appeals court has a disturbing trend of overturning juries, guilty verdicts in cases involving sexual violence. She said the ruling came at the expense and safety of women, endangering decades of progress in this incredibly complex and nuanced area of the law. That would be regarding sex crimes. But Harvey had to stay in jail because of the LA conviction. So finally, this week, the verdict of Harvey's retrial in New York after the appeals court threw out his previous conviction, it was announced. And the verdict, guilty on one count and not guilty on one count and can't decide on the third count. So Weinstein continues to say that all these women were kind of friends with benefits, kind of thing. And no one was ever forced to have sex with him. But when you listen to the testimony and hear how the night in question happened, I can see how it can be difficult for the jury. I mean, she already knew what kind of man Weinstein was, and yet she went to his hotel room anyway. But in the end, they believed her story over his. The other woman, which also did have sexual relations with Weinstein, in that one, they sided with Weinstein. And the third, well, they just couldn't decide. In any case, having these trials is just for the benefit of the victims. Even if Weinstein gets 100 years, he will most likely be dead before he serves 1 day of it. He'd age and health. He probably won't even make it through the end of his LA sentence. The interesting thing is, to this day, Weinstein still doesn't see that he did anything wrong. I mean, he invited girls into his room and he had sex with them. They came willingly. They wanted a part in a movie. But the question is, how Weinstein instigated the acts he's being charged with. I mean, doing it the same way for decades, and now in the 2000s, he's got to do 16 years for one girl. Never seemed to have occurred to Harvey that maybe all the other girls, it's believed over 100, had the same thoughts as the one that actually pressed charges against him and actually got him into court. That those incidents just happened during a different time when men had all the power and women really had none. Speaking of having the power, the Sean Diddy Combs trial wrapped up its 5th week. Combs is accused of, about everything outside of murder. The trial has so many twists and turns, I hardly even know where to start. One of the big ones is that Kanye West showed up at the trial to support his friend Diddy. The problem was that Kanye couldn't get into the courtroom. It's full. So he was led into the overflow room where he stayed about a few minutes, then he left. It's unclear if Kanye was there to support Diddy or there to get his name in the news. But I guess, he kind of got both. This week's testimony surrounded a girl named Jane. Now, Jane is not her real name, but supposedly she was Diddy's girlfriend at the time. She, of course, was involved in many of Combs's freak-offs, the parties involving drugs and staying awake for days, performing sex acts for Diddy, usually between girls looking for a break in the business, and then these paid male sex workers. Now, with Jane, the defense tried to show that Diddy gave her options on whether to join in the freak-off parties, but she said, I was just adapting to my circumstances and my environment and adjusting to the pressures of my lover. Jane told the court, responding to messages where she agreed to the sex acts, I was going along with something I really didn't feel I could say no to. She then said she resents all of it. But then came up the question of the $150,000 that Diddy gave her, to which she thought she was worth more. But the whole thing came to a climax when the subject came up of why Combs beat her up and choked her. It seems that she went to another rapper's sex party and he got mad at her. This came just after she said that she was forced to take drugs and have a type of sex with a sex worker. In other words, these people are all just plain strange. The question remains, as the defense keeps reminding us, does being strange and having your girlfriend have multiple sex partners while you watch illegal? That's the hard question to answer. However, with all the testimony that has happened so far, if none of it's illegal, maybe some of it should be. I will probably never be rich enough to know how that side of society actually lives. And this is Eric Lecain talking about interesting stories going on around the world this week right here on Radio Bandito TV. The year was 1965. Slavery had been abolished in the U.S. Black people were free to live their lives as free men. But not everywhere was as free as you might think. In places like Alabama, black people could still not use the same doors as white people, same bathroom, drink from the same fountain, eat in the same restaurants, shop at the same stores. There were still rules for black people similar to those in the time of slavery. You know, legally, you could not own a black person in 1965. However, you could segregate them from the rest of society. There were laws against this kind of thing in the U.S., and most of the states, well, they followed them. But not every state. Also, laws such as every U.S. citizen had the right to vote or the right to run for public office. But in states such as Alabama, those laws were just not being followed. So the black people protested this issue of being excluded from voting just because of the color of their skin. In the U.S., everyone also has the right to voice their opinion, the right to protest their officials. Well, in Alabama in 1965, if you were black and you protested, the local government, the police, might possibly or most probably will beat you with a billy club and spray you with tear gas. So, Martin Luther King headed down to Alabama to organize a protest march against the treatment of blacks by the local state government. The problem was there was a good chance that they were going to get attacked, and for sure the police would do nothing to help them. You see, the governor was an outspoken segregationist. He didn't believe that the blacks and the whites should mix in any way. So the president of the U.S. at the time, Lyndon Johnson, ordered the National Guard of Alabama to go to the town of Selma and protect the protesters as they marched to Montgomery. However, the governor of that state did not want the National Guard to do this. So the president federalized the troops and made sure that the protesters were protected. This was going against the wishes of the state governor. By the way, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law soon after, saying no U.S. citizen can be denied the right to vote, no matter the color of their skin. Now, I assume you can already guess why I'm telling you this story. This past week, people were protesting in the city of Los Angeles. The protests were happening because of President Trump and his immigration policies, which in some ways is intermixed with racial issues, just like in 1965. Trump had said that he got elected, that he was going to remove all foreign criminals from the U.S., that anyone that was in the U.S. illegally and committed a crime would be deported. But the problem was that Trump's people, such as the border czar, started saying any person in the U.S. that did not have their official documentation was, in his opinion, a criminal. This has been a point of contention with many officials and people in the U.S. because, well, nearly everyone in the U.S. really is some kind of immigrant. And obviously the U.S. could not function without the foreign population that does jobs that are vital to the U.S. But the Trump administration doesn't seem interested in the who or why you're in the country, or really not really so much about removing only foreigners who are the criminals. They're about how many they can remove. It didn't matter whether they were criminals or whether you had been living in the U.S. for, say, decades. Stephen Miller, who we talked about a lot here on the show, he brought all the officials from the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in for a meeting in which he supposedly screamed at them for not deporting enough migrants. He said, go to Home Depot, go to 7-Eleven, start arresting anyone that looks like they may be illegal. So, in any case, the ICE people went to Los Angeles, which is a sanctuary city, meaning migrants can be safe from deportation there while they are working on their visa. There, the ICE police could really get their numbers up because, well, it'd be almost like shooting fish in a barrel. But things were not as quite like the ICE officials thought it would be. The problem was the residents of Los Angeles stood up for the migrants in their community and protested the ICE people from being there. I mean, many of the migrants in LA have been there for decades. Many have good jobs and help the community. They pay taxes. They have children that were born in the U.S. And most importantly, have no criminal record. So, ICE was coming after these people, and the people of LA were protesting this. So, President Trump said that the protesters would be impeding the ICE officers from doing their jobs, and that the LA police couldn't or wouldn't protect them. So, the Trump administration decided to send the California National Guard. So, I'm guessing you're seeing the irony here. Not unlike what the president did back in 1965, except instead of sending in the guard to protect the people, he was sending in the guard to protect the officials. And just like then, the governor in Alabama, the California governor, said, I don't want the National Guard here. So Trump did the same thing and federalized the National Guard, putting them under the direction of the president. First, Trump set in 2,000 troops, then ordered up another 2,000. At first, Trump claimed victory and that the troops had successfully protected the ICE officers in arresting the illegal migrants. However, when Trump made that statement, the National Guard had actually not even arrived yet. But eventually they did arrive. The problem was the protests were not as big as they had thought. In fact, only a few blocks. And they were only able to really deploy 300 troops, while the rest of the troops had to wait in an office building where there was an issue about not having food or water for them. Meanwhile, the ICE officials were heading to Home Depot to try and get their numbers up on arrests. They were only able to arrest 44 immigrants. However, they claimed that these were gang members and bad criminals. But what this did was spark even more protests. More people were joining the protests, and the crowds were getting bigger. Even several influential people showed up. That included the president of the Service Employees Union. This is one of the largest unions in the country. He showed up to the protests. He was even arrested. Now, the big issue that was happening was that ICE was doing raids without informing the local government. So the local government can get the police there in position. So more and more conflicts were starting to pop up between ICE and the protesters. Things were starting to get out of hand. Protesters were throwing stones at ICE, and they burned a car. Tear gas was being used and batons to subdue protesters. Meanwhile, the governor and the mayor of LA were asking Trump, do not do this, saying that he is making the situation much, much worse, and they don't need the National Guard. But then Trump decided to not just send in the National Guard, but to send in the Marines. Now, just to be clear here, the U.S. Marines are trained in a different way than the National Guard. They are, for all intents and purposes, trained to kill people. And Trump is deploying these Marines to go up against U.S. civilians. Now, this is where the constitutional issues came up. You see, in the U.S., the president cannot send military personnel such as the Marines to fight against U.S. citizens. The people who originally wrote the Constitution realized the problems with being able to do this, so they made sure you could not do it. However, Trump claimed he just sent 700 Marines to LA to protect federal buildings and officials from the protesters. Okay. But sending them was making more and more people want to protest. So the governor sued the Trump administration, saying that they overstepped their authority and that the president can only do something like this if there is a threat to the U.S. citizens from a foreign entity, which clearly there was not. So finally, a judge said that the Trump administration had acted unlawfully and that the control of the National Guard would be returned to the governor. And here's where Trump does what he does best. He appealed the decision. So the judge in the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals paused the ruling of the lower court. Now, the original ruling said from the judge, his actions, Trump's, were illegal, both exceeding the scope of the statutory authority and violating the 10th Amendment of the United States Constitution. He must therefore return control of California National Guard to the governor of the state of California forthwith. Now, this ruling is not overturned, it's just on a pause. I need to point out that 2 of the 3 judges on that panel were appointed by Trump. Now, Trump, of course, made a statement. He said, "If I didn't send the military into Los Angeles, the city would be burning to the ground right now. We saved LA. Thank you for the decision." Quite a few people took issue with that statement, pointing out that the protests Trump is speaking of were limited to just a few streets, and the reason for the violence was because Trump sent those Trumps in the first place. I have a feeling the original ruling will stand and Trump will appeal to the Supreme Court. Well, the vote will be 5-4 or 4-5. We're getting used to this kind of thing. But there's a lot more to this than just whether you can send Marines to fight against U.S. citizens. We are now seeing a shift in what the future of the U.S. would become. If Trump is able to use the military against his own citizens, this will give him the power he needs to circumvent the courts and circumvent the Congress and the Senate, to enact martial law at will. As we have seen throughout history, he who controls the military controls the people. It's how kings have kept masses from rising up for centuries. Right now, Trump has a problem with the U.S. He's losing consistently in the courts. His policies, his executive orders are all getting shot down, and his popularity is taking a hit. Right now, his polling is at around 38%. He's below 50%, even on immigration. That's one of his main policies. People were fine with his promise of deporting criminals, but now he's dead set on deporting friends and neighbors, longtime employees, people that take care of the elderly, that work on the farms, the people that build people's houses. His immigration policies, which were popular, are quickly becoming, unpopular. For instance, there's a 4-year-old girl from Mexico on a medical visa. She has a condition in which she cannot get nutrients into her system. But there's a procedure here that in the U.S. that can send the nutrients she needs to her body. It takes 14 hours a day using an IV. Without it, she will die in a matter of days. The Trump administration sent her family a letter, and it read, and this is exactly what it said: "It is time for you to leave the United States." The letter went on to say, "If you do not depart the United States immediately, you will be subject to a potential law enforcement actions that result in your removal from the United States, unless otherwise you have obtained a lawful basis for to remain here." In other words, her health visa had been terminated. The lawyers in the case said that the termination of the visa was unlawful, not to mention immoral. In any case, the courts got involved, and the girl and her family will be able to stay in the country for now. But mostly because they made it very public. They told everybody what was happening. There are videos of ICE personnel chasing farmers across the fields. Immigrants in California crouching down behind strawberry bushes where they work, trying to hide. There's reporters in the fields videotaping the fear that's overcoming these people. One woman working in the same job for 17 years is worried they will catch her and separate her from her family. These scenes are what's causing the problems for the president. In a press conference in California, the head of Homeland Security a senior senator tried to ask her a question about the attack on immigrants. Then out of nowhere, the FBI grabbed him and pushed him to the ground. They took him out of the room. They laid him out on the floor, put his hands behind his back, and cuffed him. This is while he's yelling, "I'm a U.S. senator." Later, they removed the handcuffs and let him go. However, this was a U.S. senator. On the news later, the director of Homeland Security said, well, they didn't realize he was who he was because he didn't identify himself, which you could hear him yelling he was a U.S. senator. And of course, the fact that they were having the news conference in the building where his office is, yet no one knew who he was. But this is not even the scariest news of the week. Just yesterday in the state of Minnesota, a man dressed as a policeman and driving what looked like a police car knocked on the door of a Democratic lawmaker. She was at home with her husband, who's also a prominent Democrat. The man made his way in and shot and killed both those people. The man then had a shootout with police before escaping. Why were the police already there? Well, because the man also shot another couple who were also politicians, Democrats, one of who worked with former Vice President Al Gore. However, they did survive. There's now a warning out not to open your door in Minnesota for a single police officer, to make sure there are at least 2 police officers outside your door. Now, this has been labeled as a politically motivated crime. 1, because they're both prominent Democrat politicians, and 2, it was Donald Trump's birthday. Many suspect the killer, someone from the MAGA movement, they've already got him, that this particular day he picked as a day to murder on purpose. I guess we'll find out soon. You see, this past Saturday, things have been happening in the U.S. 1, it was Donald Trump's birthday. And for his birthday, he did something they have not done in America for a long, long time. They had a military parade. You know, the same kind that they have in North Korea and in Russia. The parade military hardware, marching troops down the street, showing off the military might of the country. Now, this was also on Flag Day and Father's Day and the 250th anniversary of the Army. Most importantly, it was on Trump's birthday. He had attempted to do this on his birthday in his first term. However, many of the military heads at that time advised against it. You see, the U.S. doesn't do these kind of things. This is the kind of things that you see more authoritarian governments do. Military parades honor their leaders or kings. But those heads of the military that stopped Trump from doing this before, well, they are gone now. Now the military is run by a Fox News talk show host, and this military parade was on Trump's priority list. Now you can imagine several people in the U.S. didn't see this military homage to Trump as a good thing. For 1, it cost $45 million to put this parade on. And 2, the U.S. does not show off its military. They don't need to. It's the largest, most powerful military in the world, and it's not something the U.S. needs to show off. But it was Trump's birthday, and well, he wanted a parade. Nearly 20,000 people showed up to the parade, and security was tight. I mean, Trump even made a statement that any protest in his parade would be met with a mighty force. Well, not too many people listened to Trump's warning. There were protests to his parade. A lot of protests. Over 2,000 different protests in all 50 states. The estimates are somewhere around 10 million people took to the streets of America to protest Trump's military birthday parade. The protests were labeled No Kings. In New York City alone, they're saying 200,000 people attended, and that was in the rain. I saw a picture of the crowd, and I think maybe it was over 200,000. Also in Philadelphia, 100,000. In other cities, you can hear reports about them saying that it was over the limit. The protesters filled the streets. They had to stop people from coming in the venues because too many people. It may have been the largest protest march in U.S. history. In Florida, Trump's home state, the sheriff went on television and said that if any protesters attack deputies in any way, and this is his exact words, "We will kill you graveyard dead." He said this goes for anti-ICE or anti-Trump protesters alike. Now, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the politician was killed, they decided to cancel the scheduled protest. They didn't want to see anybody else get killed, and I understand that. Unfortunately, for the Trump organizers, not many people showed up to support the military parade. They said that, well, there was a possibility of rain, and maybe that's the reason why nobody showed up. Anyway, some showed up, just very few. Many found it ironic that a president that did everything he could to avoid serving in the military would now be overseeing a military parade in his honor. As we know, Trump was able to avoid the military draft because of a bone spur in his foot, which we still don't have any evidence of. But the interesting part of this is that just before the parade, Trump tried to use the military to push one of his immigration policies. However, the court said it was illegal. And now his poll numbers are low, and 2/3 of the country says a military parade is a bad idea. And millions of Americans are protesting Trump on his birthday. We all know what this means. Trump needs the military now more than ever if he's going to continue to stay in power. He's like many authoritarians in the world who rely completely on the military to keep the people in check, to keep the masses from uprising. The U.S. is now at a turning point in its history. Will it go back to the original birth when it was ruled by a king? Or will it stay a country with no king? And this is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and Radio Bandito TV, talking about stories going on around the world. I'm so happy you joined us this week. Unfortunately, this will be my last show on DZRJ for a while. Unfortunately, after over 1,600 shows here on DZRJ, it's time to take a rest. I have to say, I've enjoyed every moment I have spent doing these shows and discussing things with you. I hope maybe again in the future we will have a chance to talk and learn again about what's going on in the world. So until then, as always, everyone stay safe out there, and we'll see you soon.
The views and comments of the hosts and guests are not necessarily those of the station.